Greetings to the viewers of this program. My name is Dr. Suzanne Ross. I'm a clinical psychologist and long-term educator, but I speak here today in my capacity as a representative of the Free Mumia Abu-Jamal Coalition in New York City and the International Concerned Family and Friends of Mumia Abu-Jamal. Both these organizations have been in the struggle for many years. International Concerned Family since Mumia Abu-Jamal was first arrested on December 9th, 1981, and the Free Mumia Abu-Jamal Coalition since 1993, founded by Safi Bukhari, the great revolutionary who unfortunately passed about 10 years ago with the assistance of Sally O'Brien. I'm here today to update the audience on what's happening with the case of Mumia, and also to tell you all about a very, very important event that's happening on April 26th in Philadelphia. Mumia Abu-Jamal is, as most of you know, a political prisoner who originally was on death row, sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit, and for which there's tremendous amount of evidence that he did not commit this crime. Ballistics evidence, photographs that were kept from the defense, an individual who was at the crime scene that the prosecutor never mentioned, an individual who's very, very possibly the person who killed the policeman for whose murder Mumia was charged and convicted. There was no mention of this person at the scene, even though it is known that he was at the scene, and it was referred to in a different case, the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal's brother. The same prosecutor talked about this fourth person who was at the crime scene. And despite that, when it came to Mumia's case, they only talked about Officer Faulkner, Mumia, and his brother. So there are a lot of questions about the original trial, including the fact that 15 of the 35 policemen who were on that case were subsequently indicted and arrested for corruption. All this has led people around the world, legal experts, human rights activists and spokespeople like Desmond Tutu, like the late Nelson Mandela, like Amnesty International, all organizations such as lawyers groups in England, all over the world. Thousands and thousands of people have, probably millions when it comes to it, have said Mumia never got a fair trial, and many of them feel Mumia was actually innocent. And most people are now, who are involved in this case and who've supported Mumia, now calling for his actual release. Too late for a new trial, too late to get justice any other way. Mumia was on death row illegally for 29 years. And I say illegally because ultimately he was removed from death row because they said the whole way he was sentenced to death row violated his constitutional rights. So that's why they released him. So given that they released him after 29 years of spending time in isolation, not being able to touch a relative, not being able to touch anyone but the prison guards, being able to be visited only through a plexiglass, after all that which has been called by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, that kind of extended isolation has been called torture. It has been labeled torture. Isolation was initially, the conception of it was that it was supposed to be for short-term isolating of prisoners who were out of control. Mumia was never out of control. He was never a threat to anyone. And to keep him in that kind of conditions, shackled, I used to visit him on death row. And he would come, I would see him, sometimes I'd have to shout a little, or he'd have to shout a little, so we heard each other through the plexiglass. He would come in shackles. He had to be subjected to all kinds of humiliating procedures before he came into this visiting room, where he wasn't allowed to touch anyone. Still, they had to do a strip search before he came in and when he left. And with all those conditions for 29 years, illegally, mind you, illegally, because the procedures that were supposed to be followed in instructing the jury as to how to sentence Mumia were incorrect. They did not talk about the possibility of Mumia's, of extenuating circumstances or things in favor of Mumia that would keep him from death row. They were supposed to allow the jury to exonerate the heaviest to let go of the heaviest penalty, which would be life in prison on execution. The heaviest penalty was supposed to be considered only in the light of extenuating circumstances, such as, and in Mumia's case, it was that he had had a tremendous reputation as a journalist. He had been the journalist of, he was president of the Black Journalists Association in Philadelphia. He was considered the most promising young black person in Philadelphia at one point, rated as such by mainstream magazines. All kinds, and he had a history of being loved and admired in the community, all of which would have been mitigated against the death penalty. But the way the instructions were given, the jury thought that they all had to agree that that decision had to be unanimous, which it didn't. It had to be a majority vote. And so there was Mumia, even if you thought he was guilty, he was unnecessarily on death row for 29 years. All of this points, and I mentioned all the challenges to his guilt in the first place. Another thing I didn't mention was that when I said that there were photographs that totally challenged the prosecution's version of what happened on the night of December 9th, 1981. Those photographs were withheld from the defense, number one, and the photographs showed that the police were lying. They showed that the prosecution's version of what happened did not match what you saw. One of the cars that they said was in a particular place was not there, and other aspects of their case. The policeman on the scene, the officer on the scene, is seen handling the gun, Mumia's gun, without gloves, contrary to what they had said, that they had totally protected all evidence. So there were tremendous challenges to the prosecution's version in that in those photographs. The photographs were taken by a professional photographer, Polikoff, who had offered them to the police, and the police said they weren't very useful, but of course the police had seen them and the defense had not. And during the appeals process, when Mumia's lawyer wanted to look at the pictures more carefully, he was not given adequate time to even look at them. It's only later that we've seen them and seen how powerful they were in challenging the prosecutions. Okay, so that's the background of this case for those who may not know that much about it, or for those who don't know how much evidence there is to challenge the idea that Mumia was guilty in the first place. And second of all, that people should know that even if you thought he was guilty, he was on death row unnecessarily and illegally for 29 years. So, fast forwarding to this moment, Mumia is about to turn 60 years old. Now, we wouldn't make a huge fuss of a birthday just like that. But in Mumia's case, it's 60 years where more than half his life has been in prison. And more than half his life was actually almost half his life was more than half his life. 29 years is more than half his life, was just about half, was on death row. So Mumia, and he's published 7 books, and he sends out still weekly columns and audio messages that people read all over the world that are translated into other languages, etc., etc. He just sent out a message on Venezuela that was translated into Spanish and was sent out all over the world. So and Mumia continues to speak out against the outrages of this imperialist, racist, anti-human, capitalist society. The fact that he's in prison and in the hands of the enemy, with his full life there, in some ways under their control physically, has not stopped him for 1 minute. And he continues to be an inspiration to people around the world, and to young people in particular. So we celebrate his 60th birthday because we celebrate the extraordinary heroism and courage of Mumia Abu-Jamal, the revolutionary spirit that has kept him alive. And if you saw him, you would never believe that he had spent 29 years on death row. You would never believe that he had spent 32 years in prison, because he's a loving, powerful person who has kept his dignity, his integrity, and his wisdom. So we celebrate that, the power of an individual to resist all the horrendous things that have been done to him, all the lies, all the false convictions. We celebrate Mumia Abu-Jamal and what he represents as a human being, as a revolutionary. We also celebrate our movement, which is 32 years old. The fact that international concerned family and friends of Mumia Abu-Jamal, who call themselves the uncompromising international concern family and friends of Mumia Abu-Jamal, has lasted all these years under the leadership of the MOVE organization in Philadelphia. And of course, we celebrate the organization right here in New York City, the Free Mumia Abu-Jamal Coalition, and all the other activists and sectors of the progressive movement all over the world that have taken part in the ability for Mumia to survive and ultimately to come off death row, and ultimately, and I say this in the future, hopefully in the near future, to be released from prison altogether. We celebrate a movement that has been that consistent, that strong, that principled, that has been able to make that kind of impact. So this is not the typical birthday celebration. It's not a birthday party. It's a celebration of the best of humanity, the best of resistance against evil, and the best of fighting spirit. Now, we come off a period just in the past month where once again the right-wing forces of this country, with the key role of the Fraternal Order of Police in Philadelphia, have managed to besmirch Mumia's name and distort the reality of what I just laid out once again in the right-wing media, which went along with the Fraternal Order of Police. I speak specifically, and many of you may know about this, but if you don't, of the recent nomination by Obama of a good candidate, a relatively progressive candidate, to be the Assistant Attorney General of the United States. And I'm talking about Debo Adegbile. Well, first let me say that position is a very important one, because it's the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department that brought the civil rights cases back in the 60s and got some victories. It's that division, the Civil Rights Division, that oversees, and I'm going to repeat this, the police department, police all over the country. That division oversees police all over the country. So along comes, Obama makes a decent nomination, Debo Adegbile, who has a history of fighting and winning some important victories on the issue of voting rights. I don't want to digress too much, but voting rights is a strategic issue in the United States right now. The Republicans are trying to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement with respect to voting rights and take away the protections that have been given poor people and people of color and the disenfranchised of this country. And the Democrats, though no great revolutionaries and no great friends of the people, know that voting rights is what gets them elected. In other words, the disenfranchised are more likely to vote Democratic all across the country, all immigrants, black people, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a huge campaign over these last years by the Republicans to say, we don't need voting rights anymore. Look, we have a black president, everything's cool. What? That was for the 60s and the 50s. That's not necessary now. Adegbile, and to the credit of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, for which he worked, have fought on this issue. And the Democrats, of course, aren't committed to this because they want to get elected. So there he is, Adegbile gets nominated, a relatively progressive person. Most people don't know his history on voting rights, but that was a significant part of the story. The police hate him. Number one, because he comes from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which has fought for voting rights. The police is not for enfranchising the disenfranchised. So they hate him to begin with. And to boot, the last attorneys on record for Mumia Abu-Jamal are, guess what? the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Now, Adegbile never defended Mumia, but he was acting head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when they took on the case. So, the Fraternal Order of Police can't say we're against voting rights, or they can't say we're against a progressive person overseeing the police force. So what do? They say, here is a man, Debo Adegbile. You cannot elect him. He is an advocate for a cop killer. And they begin with a campaign of bringing out all the lies and BS that were formulated over the years by the Fraternal Order of Police with their collaborators. Mumia stood over the cop and shot him point blank, which has been challenged because had he done that, there were only some shots that hit the cop, and those that did not would have left divots, marks on the sidewalk. There were no marks on the sidewalk. That is totally untrue. He had a fair trial. He had several opportunities to prove his innocence. He had a trial that was a kangaroo trial. The judge was a member, lifelong member. Check this out, everybody. A lifelong member of the Fraternal Order of Police. The judge in the case, who in Philadelphia not only got to handle the trial, but much of the appeals process, because that's how they do it in Philadelphia. So this fair trial was conducted by someone who was an embarrassment to the establishment in Philadelphia. And even local newspapers in Philadelphia that hated Mumia said, he's got to recuse himself. He's got to get off this case. Not only did he come out of retirement to handle this case, and he was often would be found napping during the case, but he was totally on the side of the prosecution all the time. Wouldn't hold up hearings to get key witnesses to show up. Got one of the lawyers. He had one of the lawyers ordered to be jailed because she wouldn't accept some instruction he gave. He was totally insulting. I mean, I was not in the courtroom in the original trial, but I was there from 95 to 97 when the appeals process was going on. He ordered a woman, a heroic woman, Veronica Jones, who had originally testified borderline against Mumia. They tried to get her to say that she had seen Mumia run away from the scene. No, she had seen Mumia shoot the cop. She wouldn't say that, but she didn't testify what she knew was the case and what she had originally written in her testimony, that she saw another person run away from the scene. She wouldn't say that. Veronica Jones was a prostitute who, in that area, who was at the time in prison for a prostitution conviction, and the police went to see her and scared her and told her that if she did not testify as they were telling her to, she would never see her children again. She had 3 young children, and they would take her away. She'd be locked up forever. They intimidated her. They lied to her. She was actually going to be released soon thereafter, but with no adequate representation, with no defense, a young woman with many prostitution charges, and she ended up withdrawing the key testimony, the key piece of the argument that Mumia that someone else had run away from the scene. This is in the original trial. During the appeals process, people tracked her down, and lo and behold, this courageous woman was willing to come to court in front of Sabo, the Fraternal Order of Police judge, in front of Sabo, and testify that she had been intimidated by the police. You know, it was chilling to be in the courtroom and hear her behind tears talking about how she could never forgive herself, and now that she was a grandmother, she wanted to clear her conscience and do the right thing and say that she had lied and that she had distorted her evidence. She hadn't actually lied, but she had I think it was primarily that she just left out key information. As she's speaking in the courtroom, Sabo is yelling at her, Sabo the judge, very rudely and menacingly saying, what is the word when you lie in the courtroom?
Perjury.
Perjury. he's saying, you can be charged with perjury. You will be charged with perjury, meaning that if she's saying she lied originally, then she can be charged with perjury for that period. And if she's lying now, she could be, but in a totally menacing way, kept saying that. Then finally, suddenly come in some sheriffs to arrest her while she's on the witness stand. And they come in with a 10-year-old driving ticket. And they drag her off to jail. Well, of course, everyone's aghast in the courtroom. Talk about a trial that's not a trial. And we immediately raised money and got her out on bail. But look at what this courtroom did. And there were so many other witnesses who were intimidated like that. Some who also came out and withdrew their testimony. Others who said it privately but not on the stand. So that was the courtroom drama that we saw, and that was the trial that the FOP keeps saying, Mumia had a fair trial and he was convicted, he had a fair trial. He had no trial. Amnesty International said that by any international standards, this was not considered a fair trial. So here goes the FOP saying this man had a fair trial, and then they get him off death row on some charges of racism, which was not how they got him off death row. As I explained earlier, they got him off death row on a procedural issue of not providing the defense an opportunity to give extenuating, mitigating circumstances, mitigating factors that would have probably gotten Mumia off death row right away. He probably never would have, because his history was amazing. I mean, how many people do you have coming to trial, to court like that, and who was president of the Black Journalists Association, et cetera, et cetera. And he had amazing character witnesses, Sonia Sanchez, all kinds of people in the community. So they lied immediately by saying they got him off on some BS charge of racism, which was, they just made it up and kind of implied this was reverse racism, the opportunistic use of racism. This is a letter and a campaign that the FOP waged. And then they referred to how Mumia was in the courtroom when they brought in the bloodied shirt of Officer Faulkner, and he smirked as he looked at the widow of Officer Faulkner. Turns out Mumia was never in court that day. Never in court. They talked about Mumia having, I mean, all the lies that they had perpetrated originally that got Mumia convicted and got him on death row, they repeated all over again. And their friends on Fox News repeated this, and both nationally and locally, and this was given tremendous coverage, and why Adegbile should not be nominated, because should not get the appointment, because he was a advocate of a cop killer. And and ironically, Adegbile never argued that Mumia was innocent and was not involved in that aspect of his case. He wasn't even directly involved in the death penalty issue. But unfortunately, the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, Mumia's attorneys, did not fight the fight that was necessary. They have limited themselves to fighting only in the courtroom. And we know that the courtroom only goes far. Justice in the courtroom goes only as far as the people will accept what is happening in the courtroom. And in this case, we saw what happened in the original courtroom with Mumia, and we know that he got off death row, but he did not get off death row because of the legal defense. I'm not taking away from the legal aspects. That was partly what contributed, but the mass movement around the world and the street actions in Philadelphia and all over the place made it impossible for them to kill Mumia, to execute him. That's why Mumia was they hoped this was going to be the great compromise where they would get Mumia off death row and the movement would shut up. Of course, the movement has not shut up and never will until Mumia is out of prison, and also until we free all the other political prisoners and until we get some justice around the issue of mass incarceration. So I want to finish about, in fact, the T-shirt I'm wearing on the back says, "Free Mumia and all political prisoners and stop mass incarceration." So we are committed to, Mumia represents the tip of the iceberg in terms of the struggle that we need in this country. One, to free our heroes of the 60s, the political prisoners, and two, to stop this horrendous mass incarceration that has brought 2.5 million people into prisons, more people in prison than any other country in the world, more people proportionally in prison than any other country in the world. This, what should be an embarrassment to the United States government in front of the whole world, that this country is, as Mumia calls it, prison nation.
Stop.
So here we have this amazing struggle between the Fraternal Order of Police and Justice on the issue of Debo Adegbile. And the NACP Legal Defense Fund does not take up the battle. It issued some press release that was not widely distributed. People did. We went to Fox News. We, the movement, went to Fox News and had a demonstration there, both in New York and in Philadelphia. We went to the Wall Street Journal demanding that they publish our letter. We did as much as we could with limited resources. We certainly wish the lawyers had, the LDF, the Legal Defense Fund, had used their prestige to present a different narrative than the Fraternal Order of Police presented. With that kind of free space to move without official challenge, there was some senators who spoke up, but there was not a strong response, that the kind of strong response that was necessary to say, who the hell, number one, is the Fraternal Order of Police to decide who's going to be the Assistant Attorney General of the United States and supervise them? Since when do the police get the right to decide who's going to supervise them? And Mumia raised that issue. And second of all, how dare they lie and distort the data in such a way as to malign not only Mumia, but Adegbile. So Adegbile lost the nomination. Now, Obama, when he lost, made a very strong statement that this was outrageous. But that's after he lost. Obama, just like the lawyers, should have been fighting all along and saying, one, it doesn't matter if Mumia killed a cop or not, though obviously there's a lot of evidence that he didn't. They have a right, anybody has a right to be defended by a lawyer. And the LDF did the right thing in defending Mumia. That's their responsibility as lawyers who are fighting for the Constitution, to defend anybody's right to get a decent defense. And they got him off death row with the collaboration of the movement by arguing correctly that the jury was given the wrong instructions. How dare the police say that he should not have had a lawyer, that Adegbile should not have defended him? How dare they say that, and how dare they get away with that? So, big defeat. Big defeat for justice. Big defeat for the LDF, the Legal Defense Fund. Big defeat for Adegbile, who was a good candidate. And big defeat for Mumia, though we pick ourselves up immediately and fight back. The minute it's during the process we fought, and we continue to fight. And so we approach Mumia's 60th birthday and this huge celebration that's going to be taking place in Philadelphia with this series of events behind us, angrier than ever, more concerned about Mumia's safety, more concerned about getting him out of prison, more concerned about escalating our fighting spirit, and more determined to take on the Fraternal Order of Police. Because the Fraternal Order of Police, as I hinted earlier, has been a defining force in the case of Mumia from the get-go. Most people don't know that when Mumia was first arrested, he actually was given bail. I think it was 200, I can't remember what it was, the amount. But in the process of being given bail 3 days later, it was withdrawn because guess who was outraged and fought against his having bail? The Fraternal Order of Police. And of course, the judges immediately withdraw under the pressure of the fraternal, just as the congressmen, the people in the Senate who everybody thought was going to vote for Adegbile, 6 or 7 of them ultimately voted against him because the Fraternal Order of Police went and pressured them to change their votes. And what they're told is, look, if you do not vote the way we tell you to vote, when you run for office the next time, we will be campaigning against you for defending an advocate of a cop killer. And anybody who voted for Adegbile to be nominated was under the threat of the Fraternal Order of Police. Now, Democrats are not the most courageous people. Democrats in the Congress are, by and large, millionaires themselves, identified with the ruling forces of this country, and mostly interested in getting reelected. So they caved in. Surprise, surprise, they caved in under the pressure of the Fraternal Order of Police. We need to do a campaign, and the Free Mumia Abu-Jamal Coalition in New York is about to launch a campaign to expose the whole history of not only the FOP in the case of Mumia, but to talk about the role of the police in, and this has been talked about before, but we want to systematize it and make a big deal out of it. The Fraternal Order of in New York State, for example, the PBA, the Police Benevolent Association, which close allies of the FOP, have been involved in the case of political prisoners such as Jalil Muntekin and Herman Bell. Every time they come up for parole, they say, they pressure politicians to say that they will never, never agree to grant parole, and that nobody should ever grant these people parole, even though they've served their minimum and have been model prisoners and clearly have a lot to give to the community. Both are extremely intelligent, dedicated to the poor people of this country, dedicated to justice, and the cops play a major role, the defining role, in keeping them from getting parole. So this is what the campaign that we want to talk about. Now, we're going to announce this. Those of you who are watching this program are getting advance notice that we're going to be announcing this campaign on April 26th in Philadelphia. Now, we ask you, all of you who can come on April 26th to Philadelphia, to please join us at this very critical moment to defend Mumia, to defend justice, to celebrate this extraordinary human being and how he survived, to celebrate our movement, and to help make it stronger and bigger. We urge you to join us. We have buses going from New York City. We have a bus leaving from Riverside Church at 120th Street and Claremont Avenue at 8 a.m. on the 26th. We have another bus leaving from 31st Street, right on the side, the southern end of the post office, the huge post office on 31st and 8th Avenue, also leaving at 8 a.m. Tickets, to order those tickets, you take down this number, I'll say it slowly and I'll repeat it, 212-330-8029. 212-330-8029. We have one of the buses is almost completely filled. The Uptown one, if you want to leave from Uptown, you better call right away. Call that number. You will be told how to get that ticket. But tickets are also being sold from the International Action Center. You have to call them first to make sure they're open. They usually open every afternoon, but Monday through Saturday. Monday through Saturday. The number there is 212-663-6646. 212-663. Yes.
633.
Excuse me, 633. 212, let me repeat it and correct myself. Thank you to the producer of the show. 212-633-6646. They're on 24th Street. They're on 24th Street and the second floor, and you can check their website as well. Also, the campaign to bring Mumia home, a new group that has been formed in the past year, also is selling tickets, and they're having a bus leave from 1199 on 43rd Street. You can look them up on the website, bringmumiahome.com, their website, and get their information for how to get tickets for them. I don't remember their phone number by heart. but I strongly urge you to come on any of those buses. And again, the Free Mumia Coalition is doing everything possible to get these tickets out, to bring them to places that are convenient. We mail them, we do whatever you need to get you on those buses. We also have some scholarship money. It's inexpensive. We're offering, these tickets are $20 round trip, but we are offering scholarship to some students, and we have a whole group of young performers, the Impact Repertory Theater, going with us, because they will be performing and they will be on the Uptown bus with us. Anybody who can't go but who has a little extra change, and these days $20 is considered change with this outrageous economy, please donate to somebody young who can't afford it to come. $20 and you are enabling a young person to go. $100 and you're enabling 5 people to go. Again, call the hotline, the Mumia Coalition hotline, to get the address for where you can send that money and how to make out a check. 212-330-8029. We need everybody positive. We need to have a strong show of force after this disaster with Adegbile. We don't get defeated by disasters. We're inspired to fight harder. So that's the next thing that's going to happen. So, to let you know what April 26th is going to be about, it's going to start out with a march. The Children of the Ancestors. It's going to be, a leading person in that march is Fred Hampton Jr., the son of Fred Hampton Sr., who was assassinated by the police. The Black Panther Party leader in the 60s in Chicago was assassinated by the police. His son is leading the march along with other young people, children of fighters and young fighters themselves. So it's going to start with the march. Then we were going to go to the Church of the Advocate, which is a historic, huge church in Philadelphia. And at that church, there will be workshops, there will be vendors, there'll be food, there'll be artwork, there'll be children's programs, panels on legal issues, panels of journalists to deal with the issue of how do we deal with the kind of repression that is dominant in the society, that allows only the right-wing journalists to get coverage and get their word out. And then there's going to be a big rally, of course, with speakers and presentations and fantastic hip-hop artists, from Dead Prez and Immortal Technique to Rebel Diaz here in New York, Circa 95. Wonderful, wonderful performers. The program is geared to young people and those of us who are older as well. It will be very inclusive. The Move family, the Ramona Africa, Pam Africa are going to start and finish the rally. This is going to be a dynamite day to inspire us all, to strengthen us all, to continue the struggle.
In 1982, Philadelphia journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal was convicted of first-degree murder in the killing of police officer Daniel Faulkner. On the July 4th weekend, he was sentenced to death. In 2001, federal court judge William Yon overturned Abu-Jamal's death sentence as illegally imposed and unconstitutional. Yet Abu-Jamal remained on death row for more than 10 years while the Philadelphia district attorney continued to pursue his execution. In 2011, the DA's office conceded defeat, and after 30 years on death row, Abu-Jamal was transferred from solitary confinement and joined the general prison population, where he continues his appeals. Mumia Abu-Jamal has said numerous times, "My only crime that night is that I survived." In fact, the effort to legally execute Abu-Jamal has only recently ended, but the first attempt to kill him may have been made on that fateful night of December 9th, 1981. Abu-Jamal was also critically wounded, shot through the chest, and found near the prone body of Daniel Faulkner. And the evidence that convicted him for the murder, well, it doesn't exist. It's been well established over the years that Abu-Jamal's trial was patently unjust. For instance, the Philadelphia DA trained prosecutors to exclude blacks from juries. In Abu-Jamal's case, 11 out of the 15 preemptory strikes were made to bar blacks from his jury. What this short film will document is how countless due process violations began just moments after the shooting of Daniel Faulkner and Mumia Abu-Jamal, when members of the Philadelphia Police Department began to manufacture Abu-Jamal's guilt and, perhaps more importantly, conceal his innocence. In the culture wars that have punted Mumia the effigy back and forth across ideological fields of politics, race, and class, the attempt has been made to diminish the relevance of Abu-Jamal as a journalist in 1981. But this man, who was elected president of the Philadelphia chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists, was already well known throughout the city as a fiercely independent up-and-coming journalist. In fact, by the age of 15, the FBI was tracking the young writer for the Black Panther Party through their draconian and illegal program known as COINTELPRO. Not for violent behavior, but because of his, quote, inclination to appear and speak at public gatherings. Also, in 1981, he was well known to the Philadelphia Police Department as an outspoken journalist who reported on police corruption and brutality, in particular with regard to the Philly PD's hostile relationship with the controversial MOVE organization, culminating in a year-long police siege of the MOVE House that ended in 1978 with the shooting death of police officer James Ramp. 9 members of MOVE were charged with the murder, and during his coverage of the trial, Abu-Jamal strongly criticized the actions of the police and the prosecution, including the implication that the officer was most likely killed by police crossfire. The MOVE trial concluded just a year and a half before Abu-Jamal and Faulkner were found shot on that fateful night. And it was only 4 months from the federal trial of MOVE leader John Africa, whose acquittal on gun charges left the police and DA's office infuriated.
When they saw who they had, that was number one. I mean, wow, look what we done ran into. We got a Panther, and we're gonna kill this Panther. We're gonna kill this nigga here, right here.
In the early morning hours of December 9th, 1981, police officer Daniel Faulkner pulls over a rundown blue Volkswagen Beetle in the bustling red light district of Philadelphia. At 3:51 a.m., Faulkner reports over his radio that he has stopped the car at 13th and Locust Street. At the same time, Mumia Abu-Jamal is parked in his cab just around the corner. He fills out his log anticipating a new fare just as the clubs are closing. He's moonlighting as a cab driver after his uncompromising approach to reporting began to cost him work as a journalist. He had recently started carrying a registered .38 Charter Arms revolver during his late-night cab runs after having recently been robbed at gunpoint. From the DA's office to Abu-Jamal's most ardent defenders, all agree that Abu-Jamal's brother Billy Cook, who ran a street vendor stall nearby, exited his Volkswagen and had an exchange with Faulkner. But what happened next has been the subject of heated debate ever since. What is certain is that the version put forth by the prosecution in conjunction with the Philadelphia Police Department at Abu-Jamal's 1982 trial is a complete fabrication, and a willful fabrication at that. After being denied his constitutional right to defend himself at his original trial, and after heeding legal advice not to testify at his appeals hearing in 1995, Abu-Jamal released a declaration in 2001 in which he details the events of that night.
I did not shoot police officer Daniel Faulkner. I had nothing to do with the killing of Officer Faulkner. I am innocent. I was filling out my log when I heard some shouting. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a flashing dome light of a police cruiser. This wasn't unusual. I continued to fill out my trip sheet when I heard what sounded like gunshots. I looked again into my rearview mirror and saw people running up and down Locust. I recognized my brother standing in the street, staggering and dizzy. I immediately exited the cab and ran to his screen. As I came across the street, I saw a uniformed cop turn toward me, gun in hand. Saw a flash and went down to my knees.
Now, the prosecution claimed that Abu-Jamal's brother, Billy Cook, was alone in the Volkswagen. Officers James Forbes and Robert Shoemaker testified at the '82 trial that they were the first officers to arrive on the scene and that they immediately found Abu-Jamal's gun as well as Faulkner's gun. Inspector Alfonso Giordano would arrive 3 minutes later and take control of the scene as the ranking officer. At pre-trial hearings, Giordano testified that Abu-Jamal confessed to the murder when Giordano asked him where his gun was, and Abu-Jamal replied, "I dropped it beside the car after I shot him." Cab driver Robert Chobert testified he was parked just behind Faulkner's squad car, witnessed the shooting, and identified Abu-Jamal as the shooter. Prostitute Cynthia White also testified that she saw the shooting. Her testimony matched that of Robert Chobert's. All of these claims, most of which form the foundation of the prosecution's case, were manufactured. Let's first look at the claim that Billy Cook was alone in the Volkswagen. After Faulkner radioed that he stopped the car, he followed with, quote, "On second thought, send me a wagon." This request for backup clearly indicates that there was more than one person in the car. Then in 1995, Captain Edward D'Amato admitted that a driver's license permit for a man named Arnold Howard, a business partner of Cook's, was found on Faulkner. Again, strong evidence that there was more than one person in Billy Cook's Volkswagen. In 1982, the police and prosecution illegally kept this evidence from Abu-Jamal and his defense attorney. Why were they suppressing this evidence of other potential suspects in the shooting of Daniel Faulkner? Now, what about the immediate recovery of the weapons? Radio transmissions from the scene to Central Command over the next 15 minutes contradict the testimony of Officers Forbes and Shoemaker. No officer reports immediately finding any weapons. In fact, nearly 5 minutes later, officers on the scene report that Faulkner's gun is missing. It was 14 minutes before it was reported that the suspect's gun was recovered and that they had the doer in custody. There is no report that Abu-Jamal confessed. There is no report that a witness or witnesses identified anyone as the shooter. Prior to the arrival of the police mobile forensics unit, freelance photographer Pedro Polikoff arrived, moving freely through the crime scene and snapping off more than 24 photos. These photos show, contrary to police regulations, that the area was not properly secured to preserve evidence. The photographs also show Officer Forbes walking around carrying both guns in his bare hand. This lack of regard for forensic evidence looks more like willful intent to manipulate a crime scene when you consider the following. Police reported no fingerprints on the guns. No tests were done on Abu-Jamal's hands for gunpowder residue. Contrary to police regulations, Officer Forbes failed to immediately turn over the weapons to the mobile crime unit. In fact, the weapons were not turned over for 2 hours. Later, the police falsely described the bullet from Faulkner's head wound as too damaged and deteriorated to do a comparison ballistics test with a bullet fired from Abu-Jamal's gun. But photographs of the bullet clearly show the identifying characteristics, its twists, the number of lands and grooves, and the relative widths. There is no physical evidence that Abu-Jamal shot Faulkner, or that his gun was the murder weapon. But what about eyewitness testimony? What about Cynthia White, the prostitute whose testimony was the linchpin to the prosecution's case? Several times after the shooting, she was arrested only to be let go after she signed updated witness statements. Each time, the story changed to make a stronger case against Abu-Jamal. By the time the case went to trial, her statement fit perfectly into the prosecution's case. Witnesses Pamela Jenkins and Yvette Williams swore that White said she was scared for her life under police threats if she didn't testify as they wanted. Witness Veronica Jones blurted out on the witness stand at the 1982 trial that the police told her Cynthia White was given a deal to say that Abu-Jamal was the shooter. Jones testified that the police threatened her to ID Abu-Jamal as well. What's more, all the civilian witnesses, both for the prosecution and the defense, testified that they didn't see Cynthia White on the scene, or only later after the police arrived. And what about eyewitness Robert Chobert? His testimony was arranged most likely by Inspector Alfonso Giordano. The official police photos, as well as Polikoff's photos, show Chobert's cab was not parked behind Faulkner's squad car as claimed by Chobert and the prosecution. In fact, Chobert was driving illegally that night on a suspended license while on probation after being paid to throw a firebomb into a grade school. During appeals, Chobert admitted that in exchange for his testimony, the prosecution said they would assist with his probation. What's more, Chobert later admitted that he was parked elsewhere and that his testimony was false. William Singletary, a local businessman, said he was standing on a nearby street corner and witnessed the shootings. Immediately after, he tried to give his statement to police that Abu-Jamal arrived after Faulkner was already shot. Homicide detectives interrogated and threatened Singletary with bodily harm as well as the trashing of his business if he testified in favor of Abu-Jamal. And then Abu-Jamal's brother Billy Cook later swore that his business partner Ken Freeman was in the car with him and participated in the shooting of Faulkner. Cook said police threatened him with his life and that he too would be charged with Faulkner's murder if he testified for his brother at trial. In 1999, a career criminal and self-described hitman Arnold Beverly confessed he shot Faulkner in the head and that Abu-Jamal arrived after Faulkner was shot and had nothing to do with the shooting. Without providing any reason except that the confession was too late, the Pennsylvania and federal courts have refused to even admit this confession into evidence. Now, while the prosecution supposedly had 4 witnesses to the shooting, none of their witnesses ever said they saw Abu-Jamal get shot. The prosecution argued that as Abu-Jamal came across Locust Street, he shot Faulkner in the back, and as Faulkner turned and was falling down, he pulled his gun and shot Abu-Jamal. An upward shot through his chest. While the prosecution tried to explain the clear downward trajectory of the bullet as a ricochet off his ribcage, medical evidence is clear. The bullet moved cleanly into Abu-Jamal's chest, through his lung and lodged near his liver in an uninterrupted downward line. The prosecution's rendition of how Abu-Jamal was shot is physically impossible. But perhaps the most striking fabrication of the case presented to jurors in 1982, a falsehood that formed the emotional foundation of the prosecution's case and its success in securing a death sentence, is the testimony of Cynthia White and Robert Chobert that Abu-Jamal shot Faulkner, execution style, standing directly over him and unloading 4 rounds, somehow 3 miss and only 1 strikes Faulkner in the face. Now, what this claim actually shows is the clear intent by members of the Philadelphia Police Department and the District Attorney's Office to frame Mumia Abu-Jamal for a crime he did not commit. Bullets from a .38 caliber weapon hitting the sidewalk would, without any doubt, leave divots as they tore into the concrete. As shown by this photo analyzed by Robert Nelson, an expert in photo enhancement and analysis at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the concrete was, as Nelson determined, quote, completely smooth. This photograph proves that White and Chobert could not have seen, as they claimed at trial, anyone stand over Faulkner and fire. This clearly supports, along with the other evidence of police intimidation, that their testimony was arranged to support a patently false, physically impossible rendition of the crime. This execution-style account invented by the police and prosecution was a key part of their concerted effort not only to get a guilty verdict, but the death penalty. Mumia Abu-Jamal's arrest for this murder was shocking to all who knew him or knew his work. The line of the Philadelphia Inquirer the next day was unusually sympathetic, stating, "The suspect, Jamal, an eloquent activist not afraid to raise his voice." Philadelphia Inquirer, December 10, 1981. Arrested and charged with murdering a police officer, Abu-Jamal from the very outset acted on his innocence, twice requesting a police lineup, a direct challenge to prosecution witnesses to identify him. He knew the real shooter, or shooters, must have fled the scene, but the court denied his requests for a lineup, just as they would deny his requests for funds that would pay for defense investigations, as well as expert ballistics witnesses. Abu-Jamal himself recounts being punched, kicked, and rammed headfirst into a pole by officers arriving on the scene. After being thrown into a police van, Inspector Alfonso Giordano assaults Abu-Jamal in the head with a police radio while hurling racial slurs. Unknown to Abu-Jamal and his defense, Giordano, as well as the commander and deputy commander of the Center City area, along with the head of the homicide division, in fact, the entire chain of command in Abu-Jamal's prosecution, were all under FBI investigation for corruption at the time of Faulkner's murder. Giordano was removed from his post as a command inspector and relegated to desk duty after the FBI and the Justice Department apparently informed Philadelphia District Attorney Ed Rendell that Giordano was under investigation for corruption and his testimony at Abu-Jamal's trial would undermine their case. Giordano resigned from the police force at full retirement pay, the first working day after Abu-Jamal's conviction. His previously publicized report that Abu-Jamal confessed to shooting Faulkner was not even introduced at trial. But the prosecution would still get their confession. The DA's office convened a roundtable meeting and asked police witnesses, did anybody hear his statement? Officers Gary Bell and Gary Wakshull, along with Jefferson Hospital security guard Priscilla Durham, suddenly report a second confession by Abu-Jamal. At this point, this dramatic second confession is being remembered and reported more than 2 months after the night of the crime. Officer Wakshull, assigned to Abu-Jamal from the crime scene through his admittance to the hospital, along with Officer Bell and security guard Durham, reportedly heard Abu-Jamal say, "I shot the motherfucker and I hope he dies." But less than 2 hours after supposedly hearing this confession, Wakshull completed his report to homicide detectives with the statement that during his entire time guarding Abu-Jamal, quote, "the Negro male made no comments." When Wakshull was questioned during appeals why it took more than 2 months to report this supposed confession, he explained that he was too distressed to remember and then later claimed, quote, "I only then realized it might have some meaning." Security guard Priscilla Durham, who had aspirations to become a police officer herself, later admitted to her stepbrother that she lied about hearing this confession. And what about Dr. Anthony Coletta, who was with Abu-Jamal from the time he arrived in the emergency room until he went into surgery and stated that he did not hear nor hear of any confession made by Abu-Jamal in the hospital? When Abu-Jamal attempted to call Wakshull to the stand during the '82 trial to counter the report of his confession, he was told by the prosecution that the officer was on vacation and was denied even a phone call by Judge Sabo to see if the officer could be reached. When Abu-Jamal protested this blatantly unreasonable and unjust denial, Sabo's response was, "Your attorney and you goofed." A comment of such cruelty is no surprise given the obvious bias and racism of Judge Sabo, who promised to a fellow judge in the presence of court reporter Terry Maurer Carter that, quote, "I'm going to help them fry the nigger."
A court cannot make an innocent man guilty. Any ruling founded on injustice is not justice. The righteous fight for life, liberty, and for justice can only continue.